Minor was the son of missionaries, and he'd been brought up, at least notionally, as a staunch Congregationalist Christian. But while at Yale, he had largely forsaken his religion, and by the time he was established in the Union Army, whether he had become disillusioned by his experiences on the battlefield or simply uninterested in organized religion, he apparently abandoned his beliefs totally and was content to have himself described without any shame as an atheist. He was for a while a devoted reader of T.H. Huxley, the great Victorian biologist and philosopher who coined the term agnostic. His own feelings were more negative still. Since the laws of nature could quite satisfactorily explain all natural phenomena, he would write, he could not find any logical need for the existence of a God. However, over the years in the asylum, these feelings of hostility began slowly to ameliorate. By 1898 or so, his absolute certainty about the non-existence of a God started to waver, perhaps in part because of the strong Christian beliefs of his frequent visitor James Murray, who was the object of Minor's intense and most lasting admiration. Murray may well have discussed the possible solace that Minor might gain from the recognition and acceptance of a superior divinity. Unintentionally, he may have triggered what turned out to be Minor's steadily intensifying religious fervour. By the turn of the century, Minor had changed. He was telling visitors, and formally informing the Broadmoor superintendent, that he now regarded himself as a deist, as someone who accepts the existence of a God, but doesn't subscribe to any particular religion. It was an important step, and yet in its own way it was a tragic one. For in tandem with these new beliefs, Minor began to judge himself by the harsh standards of what he believed to be an all-purpose, all-seeing, and eternally vindictive deity. He suddenly stopped thinking of his insanity as a treatable sadness, and instead took to thinking of it, or of some of its aspects, as an intolerable affliction, a state of sin that needed constant purging and punishment. He began to regard himself not as a sorry creature, but as someone inexpressibly vile, endowed with dreadful habits and leanings. He was in any case a compulsive and obsessive masturbator. God would be certain to punish him dreadfully should he fail to halt his wholesale dependence on self-abuse. His enormous sexual appetites in particular started to become particularly abhorrent to him. He began to be haunted by the memory, or the fantastic supposed memory, of his past sexual conquests. He began to loathe the way his body responded, and with the way that God had so inappropriately and unjustly equipped him. As his medical file reported, he believed there had been a complete saturation of his entire being with the lasciviousness of over 20 years, during which time he had had relations with thousands of nude women, night after night. The nightly dissipations had had no perceptible influence on his physical strength, but his organ had increased in size as the result of such constant use. His constant priapism had allowed it to develop enormously. He remembers a French woman remarking "bien fait" on first seeing it. Another woman had called him an apostle of pleasure. Sexual adventure and fantasy gave him as much pleasure as anything else in the world. But when he became Christianized, he saw that he must sever himself from the lascivious life that he had been leading, and decided that the amputation of his penis would solve the problem. The surgical removal of the penis is at best of times a dangerous practice, rarely performed even by doctors. An attack by the renowned Brazilian fishlet known as the candiru, which likes to swim up a man's urine stream and lodge in the urethra with a ring of retros spines preventing its removal, is one of the very rare circumstances in which doctors will perform the operation, known as a pyotomy. It's a brave, foolhardy and desperate man who will perform an autopyotomy, in which one removes one's own organ, and the more so when the operation is done in an unsterile environment and with a penknife. Among his many perks, as we've seen, Dr. Minor had enjoyed, unlike all the other Broadmoor patients, the superintendent's explicit permission to carry a penknife. It had long ceased to be of much use. Few were the occasions when he had to cut the unfinished pages of first editions, which is why he had asked for the knife in the first place. Now it just sat in his pocket, as it might in that of an ordinary man on the outside world. Except that Minor was in no sense ordinary, and he now had, it turned out, an unusual and pressing need for the knife. He was desperately certain that it was his penis that had led him to commit all the unsavoury deeds that had so dominated his life. His continuing sexual desires, if not born in his penis, were at least carried out by it. In his delusional world, he felt he had no alternative but to remove it. He was a doctor, of course, and so knew roughly what he was doing. So on that Wednesday morning he sharpened his knife on a whetstone. He tied a thin cord tightly around the base of his member to act as a ligature and to pressure-cauterize the blood vessels. He waited for 10 minutes or so until the vein and artery walls had become properly compressed, and then, in one swift movement that most would prefer not to imagine, he sliced off his organ about an inch from the base. He threw the offending object into the fire. He relaxed the string and found that, as he had expected, there was almost no blood. He lay down for a while to ensure there was no hemorrhage, and then walked almost casually to the lower gate on the ground floor of Block 2 and called for the attendant. His training taught him he'd probably now go into shock, and he supposed that he needed to be put into the asylum infirmary, as indeed the astonished Broadmoor doctors ordered. He remained there for the best part of a month, and within days was displaying his old cantankerous self, complaining at the noise the workmen were making, even though the day he chose to complain was a Sunday, when the workmen were actually all at home. The penis steadily healed, leaving a small stump through which Miner could urinate, but that, to his presumed satisfaction, proved to be useless sexually. The problem had been solved. The deity would be satisfied that no further sexual rompings could take place. The doctor remarked in his ward notes that he was amazed that anyone had had the nerve to perform such an extraordinary mutilation on himself. There remains one further possible reason for his having carried out so bizarre an act, a reason that some might think rather stretches credulity. He may have amputated his penis out of guilt and self-loathing for having enjoyed either some kind of relationship with, or lascivious thoughts about, the widow of the man he had murdered. Eliza Merritt, it'll be remembered, had visited Miner at the asylum at regular intervals in the early 1880s. She used to bring books and occasional gifts. He and his stepmother had given her money as recompense for her loss. She had said quite publicly that she had forgiven him for the murder. She had accepted, and sympathetically, that he had committed the crime while not knowing right from wrong. Might it not have been possible that in a moment of mutual consolation something passed between these two people, who were almost the same age and who in many senses were similarly reduced in circumstances? And might it not be that one day, eventually, the memory of the event plunged the sensitive and thoughtful Dr. Miner into a deep and guilt-ridden depression? No suggestion exists that the meetings between Miner and Eliza Merritt were anything other than proper, formal, and chaste, and perhaps they always were so, and any residual guilt that Miner may have felt stemmed from the kind of fantasies to which his medical records show him to have been prey. But it has to be admitted that it remains a possibility, not a probability to be sure, that it was guilt for a specific act, rather than some slow-burning religious fervour, that prompted this horrible tragedy. It was exactly a year afterwards that the question of removing Dr. Miner to the United States was raised once again. This time his brother Alfred, who was still running the China Emporium back in New Haven, suggested it in a private letter to the superintendent, a letter which Miner never saw. This time, and for the first time, the usually rebarbative Dr. Brain offered some grounds for hope. If arrangements could be made for his proper care and treatment, and if the American government would agree to his removal, I think it quite possible that the proposal might be favourably considered. A year later still, and James Murray visited, on his way back home from seeing his daughter at college in London. He told Brain that Miner was my friend, and said later he was distressed at how frail he seemed, at how the light and energy that had marked him in his dictionary-busy days of the previous decade seemed now to have deserted him. Murray was further convinced that the old gentleman must be allowed to go home to die. In England he had no one and no work, no reason for existence. His life was merely a slow-moving tragedy, an act of steady dying, conducted before everyone's eyes. William Miner repaid the pleasure of the visit in an unusually intimate way. He gave him a small amount of money. James Murray was going off to the Cape Colony, part of what's now South Africa, to attend a conference, and somehow Minor discovered that it was a journey that would stretch Murray's finances to the limit, though the normally parsimonious Oxford University Press delegates did give him £100. So Minor decided to pitch in as well, and sent out for a postal order for a few pounds, which he sent along with a curiously affectionate note, as one elder might write to another. "Pray pardon the liberty I take to enclose you a postal payable to your order, that I thought might add in a small way against unexpected demands upon your means. Even a millionaire may feel satisfaction to find he has a sovereign more than he thought, for though himself a republican, and we less gifted people have a right to a like satisfaction when chance permits. Building a house and going on a journey are much the same in costing more than one expects, and in any case I'm sure you can make this useful. Now I'll say good-bye to you both, with best wishes for your welfare, and in its uncontracted form also, God be with you. W.C. Minor." And over the succeeding weeks and months the insane man became steadily the infirm man. He fell in his bath, he hurt his leg, he tripped and twisted leathery sinews and weary muscles, he suffered from the cold, and he caught a chill. All the casual inconveniences of old age were being piled onto his madness, each a Pelion upon Ossa, until William Minor was no more than a thin and elderly wretch, feared by no one, pitied by all. Then there came a pathetic example of a smaller madness. Though no longer much of a lexicographer or a flutist, Dr. Minor remained something of a painter, and filled many hours working at the easel set up in his room. One day, on a whim, he decided he would send one of his better works to the Princess of Wales, the young woman, May of Teck, Queen Mary to be, who was the wife of the man who would soon become King George V. But Dr. Brain said no. Bleakly and predictably enforcing the rule that no inmate at Broadmoor may communicate with any member of the royal family, a rule made because so many deranged inmates supposed themselves to be members of the royal family, he told Minor that he couldn't send it. The doctor, angry and querulous, then formally appealed, forcing Brain to send the painting and a petition to the Home Office, whose minister had the ultimate say. The office, not unnaturally, backed Brain, and Brain wrote again to Minor, denying his petition. But this caused Minor to get his dander up, and he wrote furiously and barely legibly to the American ambassador, asking that he use his good diplomatic offices to transmit the package to Buckingham Palace. The package was never sent. Brain insisted that he would not allow it. So Minor sent a further letter to the U.S. Army Chief of Staff in Washington, D.C., complaining that he, an officer in the U.S. Army himself, was being forcibly prevented from communicating with his embassy. The whole saga became then the focus of a long summer month's work by a host of attachés and vice-consuls and heads of protocol and assistants to senior staff officers, all bickering and wondering whether this harmless old man's doubtless charming watercolour could ever find its way into the hands of the Princess of Wales. But it never did. Permission was denied up and down the line, and the whole episode ended in a melancholy way, for when Dr. Minor sadly retreated to his cell block and asked plaintively for his painting back, he was informed with cold hauteur that it had in fact been lost. The letter asking for the painting back is in a spidery, shaky hand, the hand of an elderly, half-sane, half-senile man, and it was to no avail. The painting has never been recovered. And there were further dispiriting developments. In early March 1910, Dr. Brain, whom history will probably not judge kindly in the specific case of William Minor, ordered that all the old man's privileges be taken away. Minor was given just a day's notice to quit the suite of 2 rooms that he had occupied for the previous 37 years, to leave behind his volumes of books, to give up his access to his writing table, his sketch pads and his flutes, and move into the asylum infirmary. It was a cruel outrage committed by a vengeful man, quite likely jealous of the burgeoning reputation of his charge, and angry letters poured in from the few remaining friends who heard the news. Even Ada Murray, now Lady Murray, since James had been knighted in 1908, recommended by a grateful Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, complained bitterly on her husband's behalf about the cruel and cavalier treatment that was apparently being meted out to the 76-year-old Minor. Brain replied limply. "I should not have curtailed any of his privileges had I not been convinced that to leave things as they were was running the risk of a serious accident." But neither Sir James nor Lady Murray was mollified. It was imperative, they said, that their scholar-genius friend now be allowed to go home to America, out of the clutches of this monstrous Dr. Brain, and away from a hospital that no longer seemed the benign home of harmless scholarship, but more closely resembled the bedlam it had once been constructed to replace. Miner's brother Alfred sailed to London in late March with a view to resolving the situation once and for all. He had spoken to the U.S. Army in Washington. The generals there said it was possible, providing only that the British Home Office agreed, to have Dr. Miner transferred to the place in which he had been incarcerated very many years before, St. Elizabeth's Federal Hospital in the American capital. If Alfred agreed to keep his brother in safe custody for the transfer across the Atlantic, then it might well be possible to persuade the Home Secretary to issue the requisite permission. Fate was to intervene in a merciful way. By great good fortune, the Home Secretary of the day was Winston Churchill, a man who, though less well known then than he would become soon, had a naturally sympathetic inclination towards Americans, since his mother was one. He ordered his civil servants to send a summary of the case up to his office, a summary that still exists, and offers a concise and intriguing indication of how governments manage their business. The various arguments for and against the parole of Dr. Miner are offered. The decision is deemed ultimately to rest only on whether, if Miner is still judged to be a danger to others, his brother Alfred can really be trusted to keep him away from firearms during any transfer. The bureaucrats working on the case then slowly but inexorably come to parallel understandings, that on the one hand Miner is not dangerous, and that on the other his brother could be well trusted if need be. So the recommendation made to Churchill on the basis of this turgid process of exposition and analysis was that the man should indeed be released on parole and allowed to go off to his native land. And so, on Wednesday, April the 6th, 1910, Winston S. Churchill duly signed in blue ink a warrant of conditional discharge, subject only to the condition that Miner shall on his discharge leave the United Kingdom and not return thereto. The next day Sir James Murray wrote, asking if he might be allowed to say good-bye to his old friend, and if he might bring Lady Murray as well. "There is not the least objection," said Dr. Brain smoothly, "and he is in much better health and will be pleased to see you." One can almost hear the lifting of the old man's spirits with the thought that after 38 long years he was finally going home. Since the occasion was a momentous one, both for Miner and for England in more ways than could be immediately understood, Murray had invited an artist from Messrs. Russell and Company, photographers to His Majesty the King, to take a formal farewell portrait of Dr. Miner in the Broadmoor Asylum garden. Dr. Brain said he had no objection. The picture that resulted remains a most sympathetic portrait of a kindly, scholarly, and from his facial expression, not uncontent figure, seemingly seated after tea under a peaceful English hedgerow, unconstrained, untroubled, careless of everything. At dawn on Saturday, April the 16th, 1910, Principal Attendant Spanholz, a lot of Broadmoor attendants were like him, Boer former prisoners of war, was ordered to proceed on escort duty, in plain clothes, to escort William Miner to London. Sir James and Lady Murray were there in the weak spring sun to say farewell. There were formal handshakes and, it said, the glistening of tears. But these were more dignified times than our own, and the two men who had meant so very much to each other for so long, and the creation of whose combined scholarship was now almost half complete, the 6 so far published volumes of the OED were packed securely in Miner's valise, said good-bye to each other in an air of stiff formality. Dr. Brain offered his own curt valedictory, and the landau rattled its way down the lanes, soon becoming lost to view in an early spring mist. 2 hours later it was at Bracknell Station, on the south-east main line to London. An hour later Spanholz and Miner were at the mighty vaulting cathedral of Waterloo Station, much larger than it had been when, no more than a few hundred yards away, the murder that began this story was committed on that Saturday night in 1872. The pair didn't linger, for obvious reasons, but took a hansom cab to St. Pancras Station and there caught the boat train to Tilbury Docks. They walked to the quayside where the Atlantic Transport Line's twin-screw passenger liner SS Minnetonka lay, coaling and victualling, bound that afternoon for New York. It was only at the dockside that the Broadmoor attendant finally relinquished custody of his charge, handing him over to Alfred Miner, who was waiting beside the ship's gangway. A receipt was duly offered and signed just before noon, as though the patient were just a large box or a haunch of meat. "This is to certify that William Chester Miner has this day been received from the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum into my care," it read, and it was signed Alfred W. Miner, Conservator. Spanholz then waved his own cheery goodbye and raced off to catch his return train. At 2 o'clock the vessel blasted a farewell on its steam horn, and with tugs yelping, edged out into the estuary of the Thames. By mid-afternoon it was off the landmark lighthouse on the Kentish coast's North Foreland, and had turned hard to starboard. By nightfall it was in the Channel. By dawn on the next fresh morning south of the Scilly Isles, and by lunchtime all England, and the nightmare that it enfolded, had finally receded, lost, over the damp taffrail. The sea was grey and huge and empty, and ahead lay the United States, and home. 2 weeks later, Dr. Brain received a note from New Haven. "I'm glad to say that my brother safely made the trip, and is now pleasantly fixed in the St. Elizabeth's Asylum in Washington, D.C. He enjoyed the voyage very much, and had no trouble from seasickness. I thought he walked about too much for the latter part of the voyage, but he didn't trouble me at night, though I felt much relief on arriving at the dock in New York. I hope I have the pleasure of meeting you at some future date. My regards to yourself and your family, and best wishes to all the Broadmoor staff and attendants." Then only the monuments. Diagnosis. Noun. Medical. Determination of the nature of a diseased condition. Identification of a disease by careful investigation of its symptoms and history. Also the opinion, formally stated, resulting from such investigation. Old Frederick Furnivall was the first of the great dictionary men to go. He died within just a few weeks of the Minnetonka's sailing from London. Furnivall had known he was dying since the beginning of that fateful year, 1910. He remained amusing and energetic to the end, sculling his little boat at Hammersmith, flirting with his waitresses at the ABC, sending his daily packages of words and newspaper clippings to the editor of a project with which he had been intimately associated for all of half a century. He started one of his final letters to Murray with a typically eccentric disdain for the illness that he knew would shortly fell him. His first expressed interest was in a word, tallow catch, that Murray had found in Shakespeare, had recently defined, and had sent down to Hammersmith for approval. Furnivall offered his congratulations for a definition that read in part, "a very fat man, a tub of tallow," a word that has similarities today with the references to a man who is a tub of lard. Only after this did he speak elliptically of the grim prognosis his doctor had offered. He had intestinal cancer, remarking, "Yes, our dictionary men go gradually, and I'm to disappear in 6 months. It's a great disappointment, as I had wanted to see the dictionary finished before I die, but it's not to be. However, the completion of the work is certain, so that's all right." He died as predicted in July, but he didn't abandon work until after inspecting, as Murray suggested that he might, one majestically long entry that was due for inclusion in Volume 11. Would it give you any satisfaction, Murray had asked him, to see the gigantic "take" in final, before it is too late? Murray himself, given his steadily advancing years, suspected that with Furnivall's passing his own end could not be too far off. And with offering "take" to Furnivall, it was evident that he had only just begun the monumental work on the entirety of the letter T. That single letter was to take him 5 long years, from 1908 until 1913, to complete. When he finished, he was so relieved as to voice an incautiously optimistic forecast. "I've got to the stage now where I can estimate the end. In all human probability, the Oxford English Dictionary will be finished on my 80th birthday, 4 years from now." But it was not to be. Neither was the OED to be completed in 4 years, nor was Sir James ever to become an octogenarian. The grand conjunction for which he hoped, his own golden wedding anniversary, his dictionary's completion, never happened. Oxford's Regius Professor of Medicine once joked that the university seemed to be paying him a salary just to keep that old man alive, so that he could complete his work. But they didn't, it seems, pay enough. James Murray's prostate gave up on him in the spring of 1915, and the burning X-rays with which such problems were then treated hurt him severely. He kept up his pace of work, completing Trink to Turn Down in midsummer, and including many difficult words that, as a fellow editor said, were handled with characteristic sagacity and resource. He was photographed for the last time in the scriptorium on July the 10th, his staff and daughters around and behind him, and in the background shelves of bound books replacing the pigeonholes with their thousands of slips of paper, which had been the familiar backdrop in the dictionary's earlier days. His academic cap still atop his head, Sir James looks thin and weary. His expression is one of calm resignation, those of the people beside him knowing and tragic. He died on July the 26th, 1915, of pleurisy, and was buried, as he wished to be, beside a great Oxford friend who had been Professor of Chinese. William Minor, now into his 5th year at the Government Hospital for the Insane in Washington, D.C., which was known until 1916 only informally by its later permanent name, St. Elizabeth's, would have heard in due course of the death of the man who had brought him so much solace and intellectual comfort. But on the actual day of Murray's passing, he merely had yet another of the bad days that he was increasingly now enduring. Some might say that it was a day on which Minor in Washington was unknowingly in sympathy with the sad events that were unfolding in Oxford, more than 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. Struck one of his fellow patients, read the notes of Minor's Cherry ward for that same Monday evening, July the 26th. He had happened to stop and look into his room, shows temper and will try to strike hard, but has little strength to hurt anyone. He had started hitting people the month before. He went walking one June afternoon along with his attendant, and the pair met a policeman. When the officer began to ask questions, Minor started pounding the attendant on the chest, though he later said he was sorry, explaining that he was becoming a little excitable. He had probably been capable of inflicting little hurt from the moment he was first entered in the hospital log. He may have been mad, but he was painfully slender. His spine was bowed. He shuffled as he walked. He had lost his teeth and had alopecia. Photographs were taken full front and in profile as if he were a common criminal. His beard is long and white, his bald head high and domed, his eyes wild. His madness was defined as simple paranoia, the doctors said. He admitted that he still thought constantly about little girls, and that he had dreams about the appalling acts they had made him perform during his forced nightly excursions. But he was not regarded as dangerous. His doctors agreed that he should be granted the privilege of walking into the surrounding countryside, if accompanied by an attendant. The stump of his penis attested dramatically to the fact that he should not be allowed access either to a knife or to scissors. But otherwise he was deemed harmless. He was just a 77-year-old man, thin, toothless, wrinkled, slightly deaf, yet very active, considering his age. His delusions steadily worsened during the St. Elizabeth's years. He complained that his eyes were regularly pecked out by birds, that people forced food into his mouth through a metal funnel and then hammered on his fingernails, that scores of pygmies hid beneath the floorboards of his room and acted as agents for the underworld. He was occasionally irritable, but more usually quiet and courteous, and he read and wrote a great deal in his room. He had a somewhat arrogant air, said one doctor. He didn't much care for the company of his fellow patients, and he would absolutely not let any one of them come into his private room. It was at St. Elizabeth's that his hitherto puzzling illness was given what might be regarded as its first modern, currently recognizable description. On November the 8th, 1918, his attending psychiatrist, a Dr. Davidian, formally declared that William Minor, federal patient 18487, was suffering from what was to be called dementia praecox of the paranoid form. No longer was the vague word monomania to be used, nor would simple paranoia do. Miner and his case history had finally been cast off from the dubious moorings of the Victorians' puzzled but determinedly moral treatment of the mad. This phrase had been coined by the Frenchman Philippe Penel of the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, and they were at last to be welcomed into the world of modern psychiatry. The new phrase, dementia praecox, was quite precise. By the time Davidian employed it as a diagnosis, it had been current for 20 years. It literally meant early flowering failure of the mental powers, and it was used to distinguish a condition in which a person begins to lose touch with reality, as Miner had done early on in his life, in his teens, his 20s, or his 30s. In this sense, the illness was markedly different from senile dementia, a term once used to describe the decrepitude that specifically accompanies old age, and of which Alzheimer's disease is one kind. The nomenclature was published in Heidelberg in 1899 by the German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, who at the time was the supreme classifier of known mental ills. His naming of the condition was designed less to distinguish it from being an old person's ailment as to mark it as very different from manic-depressive psychosis, an illness that had enough similarities to confuse the earliest of the alienists. Kraepelin's view, revolutionary at the time, was that while manic-depressive psychoses had identifiable physical causes, such as a low level of the alkaline metal lithium in the blood and brain, and were thus treatable, as with the use of lithium pills, for example, to make up a depressive's lack of it, dementia praecox was a so-called endogenous ailment, quite lacking in any identifiable external or chemical cause. In that respect, it was to be regarded as similar to such enigmatic systemic physical disorders as essential hypertension, in which a patient develops high blood pressure, and its many untidy and inconvenient side effects, for no obvious reason. Kraepelin went on to define 3 distinct subtypes of dementia praecox. There was catatonic, in which the motor functions of the body are either excessive or non-existent; hebephrenic, in which grotesquely inappropriate behavior begins during puberty, hence the word's origin from the Greek hebe, youth; and paranoiac, in which the victim suffers from delusions, often of persecution. It was from this kind of dementia, according to Kraepelin's classification of the time, that Dr. Miner was suffering. The traditional treatment offered to him and his kind was still simple, basic, and, by today's standards, dismayingly unenlightened. Those suffering from paranoid dementia were deemed pathologically incurable. They were removed from society by court order and were placed, kindly, tenderly for the most part, thanks to Pinel's powerful influence, in cells behind high walls, so as to cause no inconvenience to those living in the normal outside world. Some were incarcerated for only a very few years, some for 10 or 20. In the case of Miner, his involuntary exile from society was to last for most of his life. He existed for most of his first 38 years on the outside until he killed George Merritt. Then, for 47 of the 48 years that were left to him, he was locked away in state asylums, essentially untreated because he was, in the view of the doctors of the day, essentially untreatable. Since the time of Miner and Davidian, the illness has become much more liberally regarded. Its name, for a start, has changed. What was initially the far less daunting word schizophrenia, it came from the Greek for split mind, made its first appearance in 1912. I should say parenthetically it may well change again. To rid the ailment of its patina of unpleasant associations, there are now moves, perhaps not entirely prudent, to have it called Kraepelin syndrome. Early treatments for the disease, which were just being introduced at the time of Miner's final decline, involved the use of massive sedatives like chloral hydrate, sodium amytal, and paraldehyde. Today, entire shelves of costly antipsychotic drugs are available, at least to treat and manage schizophrenia's more discomforting symptoms. But so far, and despite the spending of fortunes, there have been precious few advances in staying the mysterious triggers that seemingly set off the illness and its demonic mischiefs. And there continues to be much debate about what these triggers might be. Can it ever be said that a major psychological illness like schizophrenia, with its severe disruption of the brain's chemistry, appearance, and function, truly has a cause? In the case of William Minor, could the terrible scenes at the Battle of the Wilderness actually have triggered his florid behaviour? Might his branding of an Irishman have precipitated, led directly or contributed even indirectly to the crime he committed 8 years later, which led to the exile he was to suffer for the remainder of his life? Was there ever an identifiable happening? Had he ever been exposed to the mental equivalent of an invading germ? Or is schizophrenia perhaps truly causeless, a part of the very being of some unfortunate individuals? Moreover, what is the illness? Is it simply the development of a personality that is several steps beyond mere eccentricity, and that steps into areas that society does not find itself able to tolerate or approve? No one's quite certain.